question, and we'll continue the discussion in the panel then. So thank you, Martin. And our next speaker will actually make a move from Australia to Finland. So now our next speaker is Professor Eetu Mäkelä from the University of Helsinki, and Eetu also works as one of his roles is that he is the technical director of FIN-CLARIAH. So without further ado, Eetu, the floor is yours.
Thanks. And I'm trying to use my 10 minutes to come up with a slightly incendiary intervention, a methodological one, starting with the bold claim that I claim that most current computational analysis in the humanities and social sciences are false. And then I'll end up with sort of a segue into the Darjafi research infrastructure and how we are beginning to try to do something about that. But to the question, why do I think most current computational analysis are false? The answer is that I think currently most work has a lack of source or algorithm criticism in one aspect, and I'm going to give sort of 4 problems in this talk, and I think most studies have a lack in at least one of these aspects. And I think this is really interesting because the humanities, people in the humanities have for a very long time prided themselves in precisely source criticism. But when we are dealing with massive, large data sets, the kind of source criticism and algorithm criticism needed is completely different. And people currently lack an understanding of what is required and how to do that. And that's something that I think needs to change. But first, the problems. So the first problem is that we're usually dealing with huge amounts of data that haven't originally been gathered for research. And then the question is, what is the data actually representative of? And here are a couple of examples. Here are sort of digitized or cataloged books in the Finnish National Bibliography in the Swedish language. And there's a curious drop here at the start of the 19th century. And it just turns out that that isn't a real phenomena. It's because those Swedish language books haven't been transferred from card catalogs to the digital database. Here's a data set that Krista has been working on, a Finnish online forum, and turned out that the data set that the researchers originally had was actually missing a lot of the messages from a particular year. And on the other hand, certain periods had huge spikes in spam bot behavior. So here, corresponding, for example, to Australian tweets, do we have an understanding of what is actually there? What does Australian tweets in the context of this collection mean? How many of them are bots? Are we interested in bot behavior, human behavior? We would need to be able to subset that huge data set into something that's actually representative of what actually interests us. And I think this sort of the fact that we are dealing with huge data sets and no one truly knows everything that goes on in there currently is a huge problem. The second one is that, again, these data sets haven't originally been sort of created for research, and the whole point of doing something computational to them is usually to transform them from raw tweets or raw sort of images into something that can be sort of quantitatively observed, or even search for in an interface for qualitative analysis. But the problem here is that if the computational algorithms that we use sort of perform better in one part of the collection than another, then what they return will be biased. And then if we make inferences based on those transformations, our inferences will be biased as well. Here's an example of sort of OCR working better for Antiqua fonts than Fraktur fonts. And also in this one collection, we found out that OCR sort of quality both improves the more modern works are OCR'd, as well as is much better on books than pamphlet size publications. So that will bias the material that we are doing sort of studies on. And if we don't counteract that bias, our conclusions will be false again. The third algorithmic problem is that way too much still people take on algorithms off the shelf developed by computer scientists for other tasks. So for example, if you want to find out how effectivity appears in journalistic texts, or for example, how parliament what the attitude of different parties in parliament are to nuclear technology, you definitely shouldn't just pick up a sentiment analysis tool off the shelf, because that's meant for really explicit evaluative language on Twitter or on review sites, and you will go completely wrong trying to apply it to much more subtle genres of expression and in the end somewhat unrelated interests. And then the final fourth problem, I think, is that when we're dealing with human data and human interactions, there's in these data sets, there's just so much going on that so many interactions that they very easily confound any results. So here's an example where we took the sort of representation of different Finnish parliamentary sort of parties in public media, and the initial sort of regression analysis showed that that the media was highly favoring the central party and disfavoring the Finnish populistic party. But when we added further covariates and sort of took account to, for example, what the parliamentary roles of each party was and whether they were in government and not, and how many ministers they had and so on, turned out that all of these initial biases vanished, and instead we found out that the amount of publicity each member received was hugely dictated by their sort of hierarchical position in power. And then our interest turned actually to the anomalies from this, because there were a couple of parliamentarians who received much more sort of public eye than they, from their position of power, should have. So these four problems, I think most research currently struggles with at least one of them, and these aren't understood enough, and people don't have the knowledge to counteract them. And the other problem is that doing all of that is actually so much work, because you need thorough analysis of what the data set actually contains, what kind of phenomena are interacting there. And you also, when you try to apply an algorithm on it to derive something that you can sort of do statistics on, it's not enough that the algorithm has been evaluated on a general case. You really need to understand its performance on your particular task and your particular data set, and not just on a global level, but also different parts of the data set that you're interested in comparing. And all of this in addition to just the pure basic sort of functionality, which is hard on how we compute things on these large data sets in the first place. So how to move forward from this is that I think the only workable option is that people interested in the same data sets should band together and form communities in the sort of best practices of open science, and then do these together. So sort of do the necessary groundwork for figuring out what is in the data and how to extract representative subsets of it, and how the different algorithmic enrichments work for them. And to facilitate this, I think infrastructure as a sort of a research infrastructure in the computational data-centric humanities and social sciences. I think infrastructure is a good actor to try to enable, host, and facilitate and coordinate this work, which brings us to my role as the sort of technological director of DARIAH FI infrastructure, and how we are sort of trying to approach this there, which is that we've identified certain large national data sets of broad interests, and we are trying now to move them into the care of our national computing infrastructure, which we are in Finland very much blessed with. We have a national sort of scientific computing infrastructure that is really great. But then in addition to the data, we are trying to bring together all the different research groups working on tools and algorithmic refinements that target these central data sets, and encourage them to build on the sort of same infrastructure so that it will be kind of standardized and have common best practices. And by that, we hope, because we've had the problem before, that people keep reinventing the wheel and doing the same enrichments to the same data, but in slightly incompatible ways. And we never sort of are able to bring these together. So that's something that we hope to improve by bringing them on top of a sort of a national shared uniform infrastructure. And then to actually tackle the much more complex and problematic sort of human interaction aspect of this, where we need not just the technical infrastructure to be compatible, but we need the humans to liaison with each other. We have a sort of a network structure where each university in Finland has a local DARIAH FI node that is tasked with sort of liaisoning with the local researchers and figuring out their interests and what they should be a part of. Thanks.
Thank you, Eetu. Wonderful. And again, lots of applause. Time for questions and comments. One quick question and comment, or comment.